So hello, everyone, and welcome to Passing in Plain Sight, a conversation on Jewish passing narratives. My name is Rebecca Glasberg, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Taube Center for Jewish Studies. And I will be moderating today's discussion with my colleagues Jonathan Branfman and Courtney Hodrick. Before we begin, I would like to offer our sincere thanks to the Taube Center for Jewish Studies and the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, who so generously co-sponsored this event. And I would also like to thank Shana Hammerman and Eva Clem for their support organizing and promoting the event. A bit about our two speakers. So Jonathan Branfman received his PhD in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies from The Ohio State University. His research focuses on how Jewish performers embody race, gender, and sexuality in U.S. popular media, including digital media like YouTube. Jonathan's work invites Jewish, feminist, queer, critical race, and media studies to grasp how historical anti-Semitism shapes present-day U.S. visual culture and how Jewish stars harness this stigma to enter America's core cultural debates. Before coming to Stanford, Jonathan held positions at the College of William and Mary and Cornell University, and I am delighted to share that next year he will join the Hadassah Brandeis Institute for Jewish Gender Studies at Brandeis University as a research associate. Yay! Should you enjoy what he has to say today, and I think that you will, I would also encourage you all to attend his upcoming book talk, Millennial Jewish Stars, Navigating Racial Anti-Semitism, Masculinity, and White Supremacy, which will take place on Thursday, May 23rd from 12 to 1:30 p.m. at the Atneve House, if I pronounced that correctly. Awesome. Courtney Hodrick earned her PhD in German Studies with a PhD minor in Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies from Stanford University. Her research focuses on 20th century German and German Jewish thought with an emphasis on the concept of modernity as crisis. Her work has appeared in Telos, Critical Theory of the Contemporary. Currently, Courtney is developing her dissertation, The Concept of Hope in the Works of Hannah Arendt, into a monograph. And I am delighted to also announce that Courtney will be back next year as a lecturer for the Stanford College program. Yay. Huzzah. All right, and now to the topic at hand. So as Elaine Ginsberg writes in the introduction to Passing in the Fictions of Identity, the genealogy of the term passing associates it with the discourse of racial difference. As the term metaphorically implies, such an individual crossed or passed through a racial line or boundary, indeed trespassed, to assume a new identity. Well-known examples of passing narratives include those of Claire Kendry, the mixed-race protagonist of Nella Larson's 1929 novel Passing, who lives her life as a white woman, and which, as you can tell, is now a film on Netflix. And Coleman Silk, a Black university professor who reinvents himself as Jew in Philip Roth's 2000 novel, The Human Stain. And interestingly enough, well, maybe not, we can talk about, in the film adaptation, it is Anthony Hopkins, who is neither Black nor Jewish, who plays this character. Yet passing is not only embedded within fictional narrative, indeed, as the controversies surrounding the racial and cultural origins of former NAACP chapter president Rachel Dolezal and former George Washington University Professor Jessica Krug show us, social responses to perceived racial and ethnic transgressions actively participate in creating the narratives that structure our lived experiences and inform how we navigate the world around us. So our question for today: how does Jewishness, which is defined at times as racial and at other times as ethnic or religious or even national, how does this complicate our understanding of what passing entails and also what it might not? So together with Courtney and Jonathan, we will explore narratives of Jewish passing, discuss the ways in which Jewishness underpins and challenges dominant understandings of racialization processes, boundary transgressions, and constructions of national and cultural identity. So today we will have a kind of structured Q&A, and then after we have a more structured section, we will open it up to the audience. So please keep track of whatever you would like to ask anyone up here. So first question for today, if you could both speak a little bit about how passing comes up in your work, which I'm going to define very broadly to include teaching, research, and also possibly personal experience in the academy. And then what different types of passing do you encounter? So maybe I'll start with Jonathan and then Courtney.
Sure. I would say my interest in passing grew out of personal experience. When I was growing up, there were 3 different types of passing happening in my house. So my mother is deaf but passes as hearing. And then also, as a Jewish family, we were sometimes in situations or locations where it would not be wise or safe to like have it be known that we were Jewish. And so early on, there were conversations about like having to pay attention to where you are and what you're wearing and what you talk about for your physical safety. And then also I was in the process of figuring out that I was queer and then like coming out to myself and deciding when to come out to my family and then to come out to other people beyond the family. So that kind of interplay of experiences eventually led me to create a course on passing films. And then in the process of teaching that course at several different universities and now here, I have begun a new book project about passing films such as BlacKkKlansman and Made in Manhattan and Mrs. Doubtfire.
Amazing. Courtney.
Yeah, I think like John, my interest in passing is connected both to my teaching and to my own personal experiences. So I am matrilineally Jewish, but was not raised Jewish, don't have a sort of Jewish sounding last name, whatever that means. Frequently I'm told that I don't look Jewish, whatever that means. And so I'm very aware, especially given what your question about academia and the sort of pressures that individuals face to assert and occupy different identity categories. I'm aware of having to deliberately and consciously navigate identity categories and sort of have to choose how to position myself and choose how I want my students, my peers, my colleagues to read me. And so that's the personal angle. And then when it comes to my work and my teaching especially, so I'm teaching a class right now on German Jews. And it is remarkably hard to give a clear answer to who counts as a German Jew. I'm focusing in this course on the period from 1800 to the present, and you get a transition from Jewishness as a religious identity that can be left behind through conversion into a racialized national model of Jewishness. And so when I teach someone like Karl Marx, for example, who is from a Jewish family, but his whole family converted when he was a child, what do I do with his identity when I'm deciding how to present him to my students, whether to even include him on a syllabus, when I'm making these sort of boundary determinations about who belongs where in the field? The question of the passability, the porousness of these boundaries and these categories comes to the fore.
Great. So kind of in a similar vein, the concept of passing, as we've discussed earlier, I think generally can now be perhaps expanded to include other types of passing, but kind of as a starting point, often entails transgression of clearly defined racial categories, which are not always or perhaps ever easily pin downable. Such as some of the examples of Nellen Larson's novel or Philip Roth's novel. I'm wondering, how does Jewishness fit into or perhaps trouble a more general passing black-white framework, which is kind of often a point of departure for many of us in the American context, given that sometimes Jewishness functions as a racial category, but not always, and then sometimes as a racial category and also as another type of category?
Really good question. Do you want to start?
So I think one of the most interesting trouble points on Jewishness as it relates to the black-white racial category in America is Hannah Arendt's essay, Reflections on Little Rock, where she writes about the integration of Little Rock High School and argues against the National Guard coming in to integrate this school, and makes the stance basically that, social change shouldn't be done by the children, the adults should be the ones stepping up, and that if people don't want to accept you, forcing them to do it at gunpoint is going to violate the freedom of association. And how sympathetic you find this argument often depends, I think, on whether you see her as a white woman in America in the 50s benefiting from the, black-white racial hierarchy, or whether you see her as an immigrant who had fled white supremacist persecution, who had grown up being discriminated against, has stories about her teachers in school saying anti-Semitic things, her classmates saying anti-Semitic things and being supported by the school. And so whether you think she's empathizing with the white students who don't want black students in their school, or with the black students who shouldn't have to go, in her mind, to school with white racists. And that's been fought out a lot in the scholarship. I'm not going to weigh in on that question because that would take us way into the weeds. But I think it's a moment that shows the way that the position of Jews in America is a complicated one, especially given the way that, passing over an ocean from one racial context into another, from one legal context into another, can really change someone's positionality within society.
Absolutely. And I think building on that and building on the example you brought up, a term that I use both in my writing and teaching is the term conditional whiteness to describe the experiences of white-presenting Jews in America. And of course, let's also keep in mind that there are many Jews who are people of color who experience a different kind of passing because people refuse to recognize them as Jewish, even when they say that they're Jewish. But for Jews with white skin, there's often this ambiguity where you never know if other people see you as actually white or as passing as white. And you may not find out until it's too late and you're in some dangerous situation. And so going back to your question about clear-cut boundaries, I think for a lot of Jewish people with white skin, you actually never quite know, even if you view yourself as in one place racially, you can never be guaranteed that other people will see you in the same way. And you can never predict what the consequences might be if they consider you to be passing as white rather than actually white. Like, are they going to make some kind of microaggressive comment, or are they going to try to physically hurt you? And that ambiguity, I think, is often not visible to people who are not Jewish, who just see the skin color and might say there's nothing more to say.
And probably when you were talking, conditional whiteness is probably, I would imagine, very context driven, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Fascinating. Okay, so continuing. So as with Larson's protagonist, who is mixed race, so I'll show you just this, who is played by Ruth Negga right here, but she presents as white. Both of you work on Jews who are of mixed Jewish and non-Jewish background, and whose Jewishness is therefore, as a result, kind of what you mentioned, called into question. So John, I'm thinking about Drake and Jews of color and Black Jews in specific, more generally, and the ways in which kind of the framing of being Black and a Jewish can suggest that one is both, but then can also suggest that one is neither fully one nor the other. And then Courtney, I'm thinking about German Jewish writer and thinker Max Czolek and how his critics try to delegitimize his critique of German Jews by highlighting how many non-Jewish grandparents he has. So what do these tensions tell us about the assumptions that undergird 21st century understandings of Jewishness, and how Jewishness relates to other racialized groups?
Sure. I think one important point that comes up when thinking about the experiences of Jews of color is the interplay of racial categories and religious categories. So for example, Drake, of course, has been in the news a lot recently, but he has also been in the news for a long time. And no matter how many times he says that he's Jewish, everyone has a hard time remembering. People are always shocked. Like whenever I talk about him, somebody always says, Drake is Jewish? And partially that's because in America's imagination, there's this image of Jews as having white skin. But also very often in American culture, there's this idea of Blackness being Christian. And of course, the Black church has played a really important historical role in Black communities. But because of this assumption, sometimes there's this idea that if you are not Christian, then you can't be authentically Black. And that's also a topic that other Black Jewish writers have written about, like Mara Gad, who in her memoir speaks about like being told, like simultaneously experiencing racism from white presenting Jewish folks, and then also experiencing a sense of exclusion from Black folks who are Christian, who see her as not authentically Black because she is Jewish. And so even though in America we tend to speak about race and religion as these very separate categories, they actually do interplay and co-shape each other a great deal.
I completely agree on the interplay of race and religion, and the example of Max Czolek is a good one. So he's a German Jewish writer about my age. He's a millennial. He's very left-wing and is a sort of polemicist who wants to call for Jews in Germany to have greater solidarity with other marginalized groups. And he's received pushback both from the German press and also from other German Jews for speaking as a representative of German Jewry. He has one Jewish grandfather. So his paternal grandfather is Jewish, which means that under halakha, Jewish religious law, he doesn't count as Jewish. On the other hand, said grandfather was in a concentration camp. He was in Dachau. Max Czolek himself, if he had been alive in Nazi Germany, would have been counted as Jewish under the racial categorization of that legal system. He's, eligible for right of return under the racial categorization of the Israeli legal system. And so when you have these overlapping sets of law, the question of who counts as a representative of the community and the way that calling someone's credential as a member of the community into question becomes a way to kind of sidestep critiquing their ideas as such, instead of saying, we think that he is wrong about what German Jews should do, should be, etc. They just sort of try to silence him is really interesting to me. The way that the question of who gets to speak becomes its own type of debate.
And who has the right to have an opinion on?
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. So now I want to transition a little bit, and I'm interested in kind of questions of non-deliberate Jewish passing. So what we've seen, kind of the examples I pulled up in the introduction are examples where people, either fictional characters or people who exist in real life, kind of actively want to be perceived as an identity that we might say they were not born into. But that's not always the case, because occasionally, like you were talking about, sometimes you are perceived as a certain identity. You might not make any attempt to portray that. People are going to read you as such. So I'm wondering about kind of, I think you termed it this non-deliberate passing. So when Jews who identify as Jewish are perceived by others as non-Jews, and what that means. And also when someone's Jewish background is used, this kind of comes up more for you, Courtney, as a framework through which to approach their work. So reading Marx as Jewish, maybe, even when that Jewish person in question might not feel that is appropriate, to put it sometimes lightly. So I'm wondering kind of how does this come up for you, if it does, and then how do you handle it, or what questions do you grapple with in trying to figure out how to handle it?
Sure. I answered the first one first, the last one first. Do you want to?
Yeah. I think the question of what is Jewish about modern Jewish thought is one that comes up for me a lot. And so thinking about non-deliberate passing, someone like Arendt, right, studied Christian theology, was from a very assimilated German Jewish background, had to some extent, a better grasp of Christian theology, secular German philosophy than she did of the Jewish tradition. And so looking at the different influences that go into her writing, I find myself often asking, what parts of what she's saying are Jewish? Not necessarily everything written by someone who happens to be Jewish is Jewish writing, but at the same time, there's a collected volume of her works called The Jewish Writings, which sort of implies that like everything else isn't. And I don't think that's right either. And so, especially for people who are very assimilated, I almost want to think about it in terms of intellectual passing, right? There's a degree of comfort with an intellectual milieu that is shared with their non-Jewish contemporaries. They're in dialogue with people who aren't Jewish. And so then the question of how to, I think a lot about how to delineate disciplinary boundaries, right? Who should be read in Jewish studies, who should be read in German studies, the kind of political questions behind which scholars work on which thinkers. I think that's where I think you often, as a scholar, as an instructor, as a person in an academic community, end up having to stake your own claims and come up with your own agenda when it comes to these figures who are marginal, who can be read in these different ways. One of the method questions that I think you have to ask yourself as a scholar is how you deal with a writer's identity.
And then in my work, one way that non-deliberate passing comes up, both in teaching and writing, has to do with the film BlacKkKlansman. Show of hands, who has seen BlacKkKlansman? So as you may know, it's based partially on a true story. It's about a Black non-Jewish policeman and a white presenting Jewish policeman who pass as members of the Ku Klux Klan to spy on the Klan. And it's specifically the Jewish policeman who goes in person to these meetings and is passing as a white supremacist. And eventually the two policemen have a conversation with each other about Black passing and Jewish passing, and the Jewish policeman says something like, I wasn't really raised Jewish, I knew that I was Jewish, but never really thought about it, and so I didn't really consider myself Jewish until now when I'm in these situations where the Klan would kill me for being Jewish. And so it raises this ambiguous question, was he always passing, or has he only now begun passing that he's infiltrating the Klan? And certainly when I'm teaching this topic, something I like to bring up or help students think about is that for anyone who's Jewish who can undeliberately pass in the present, it's because somebody before them chose to deliberately pass. A grandparent or a great-grandparent chose to change their language, change their clothing, change their religious practice, change their name, change their nose. And so even for people who are non-deliberately passing, there is actually a history of deliberate passing. And I think even for people who undeliberately pass most of the time who are Jewish, there always come certain moments where you then have to ask yourself, am I going to deliberately pass in this situation, or am I going to come out as Jewish? And also on that note, since the phrase came up, I always say growing up Jewish was great practice for being gay. Both invisible identities, you're trying to figure out who's on your team, but also not be caught by other people who might hurt you. Same parts of the country don't like you, same people want to convert you. So you monitor your environment in similar ways, and you decide what to wear and how to move and what dialect of English to speak. And so it all transferred very well.
Wow, I don't have. How can I possibly match that? But I will ask you another question. Speaking of boundaries that we transgress and how you handle them. So passing entails transgression of what are ostensibly clear and defined boundaries. And at the same time, the fact that passing can happen at all suggests that the boundaries are in fact either not there, or if they are there, they are quite porous or fungible. And I'm wondering, do Jewish passing narratives as the type of passing or kind of boundary transgression that you all work on, do they reinforce or do they undermine social hierarchies, the social hierarchies upon which they are based?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I would say that most passing narratives that I'm familiar with both blur these boundaries and reaffirm them. I think actually very often people like to consume passing narratives precisely because they offer this thrill of transgression, but ultimately a kind of safe conclusion where all the boundaries get redrawn again. So if you think of a gender passing film like Mrs. Doubtfire, where in the end, of course, the wig comes off and this heterosexual family is reestablished, but now in like maybe a slightly more progressive version. And so I think most passing narratives that are commercially successful do both. I also think it's valuable to think about how these boundaries vary so much from place to place and time to time. Like, Courtney, I love the phrase you used of like Hannah Arendt passing across the ocean to pass into new racial categories. And likewise, so many of the rules that we operate by in American society, for example, about race, are different in different places. So for example, the one drop rule in America, this notion that no matter how you look, if you have one drop of non-white ancestry, then you yourself are not white. There are other societies where that is not, those are not the rules. So for example, for those who listen to NPR, there's a podcast episode from NPR about race in Brazil and how very often in Brazil, racial categories really do just operate on how you look and not your ancestry. And so whereas in the US, you can't like have a Black mother and be white, in Brazil, you can. Or like in the US, it would be nonsensical to say, you know, my sister is biracial, but I'm white. But in Brazil, in fact, it is considered quite normal that different family members might have different racial statuses.
Like the extent to which phenotype plays into
right.
how race is received.
That it's more fully based on appearance rather than ancestry. And so somebody who is passing as white in the US could take a flight to Rio de Janeiro and be white. Or conversely, somebody who has always considered themselves white in Rio could migrate to the US and then find out that they're passing as white here. So yes, the boundaries are not only porous in each place, but also clash against each other when you go from place to place.
Yeah, I think the idea of passing depends on things being mutually exclusive that are not actually mutually exclusive, right? So if we said that, you know, Drake were a Jewish man who passes as Black, that would depend on the idea that you can't actually be both, when in fact he is both at the same time. You know, I think I agree, therefore, with what you said about the way that passing narratives transgress categories in order to reinforce them. They depend on this idea that there is a line, and often people are on both sides of that line. You know, to go into a little more detail of my own family history, I like to give the example that solely on my mother's side, even just ignoring my father, you know, I am the descendant of Jews, and I am also the descendant of someone who fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. And those are both true at all times. And, you know, sort of thinking about how to hold those dialectically in a system that wants to draw neat categories and wants to say you're one thing or you're another thing is challenging. But I think when we think about what it means to pass as something, I think it really does imply a crossing over, a motion, rather than the superposition of being two things at the same time, of being in two places at once.
Yeah. So now maybe a slightly trickier question, but I think now we're ready for it. So passing as a concept is arguably based upon essentialized, and particularly in the case of race, like ostensibly biological understandings of identity. So there must be a defined category that one transitions from into another category that one transitions into. So how do you productively address this in your work while also ensuring that you do not kind of perpetuate essentialized understandings, particularly of racialized identity? It strikes me that in the critique of Cholik, right, it sounds like a very Nazi era critique to say you're not Jewish enough for, to go back and count grandparents, for example.
So this is why I end up coming down on the side of there being different systems that people get interpolated into, right? And so with someone like Cholik, we can look at the system of halakhic law. We can look at the system of, Nazi era law, the system of, different modern day laws, the ways that people are categorized legally, which is all to say that I think often we don't necessarily get to choose how we identify. We get identified by systems. One of the things that I sometimes say about the people that I work on is that they, because I work on a lot of German Jews who were born early in the 20th century, they more or less believed that they were white and believed that they were German and believed that they were European, and then got legally reclassified because suddenly there was a new system of laws and there were new classifications, and the facts of their own identity, the facts of their own family history, the facts of their own appearances, right? None of that changed, but the legal system did change. And so I always try to pay attention to the different sets of forces, especially legally, that structure who gets categorized as what, and think about it that way. And I think being mindful of categories as historically contingent, as contingent across both time and space, as John gave the great example of Brazil as a place where you can be categorized differently, I think can help us stay out of essentializing, because we can be mindful of the fact that these are systems that are created by people and they can be changed by people and they can be fought by people. And so we don't need to just accept the specific categorizations that we happen to be living in right now, especially when it comes to questions of legal difference, right? When people aren't treated equally in front of the law. That's a thing that we can fight to change.
And building off of Courtney's point, I do think it's important when we speak about passing to always be very clear that we're not talking about objective categories. We're talking about socially constructed categories. So like somebody who is passing as white in the US today, it's not that they are lying about their true essential nature, it's that they are refusing the social rules of our society in this time, rules that might be different in a different time and place anyway. And, as one other example, even though we're speaking mostly about racial passing, think about passing in terms of sexual orientation. There are parts of the world, for example, parts of Latin America, where for men, if you are kind of presenting as stereotypically masculine, and if you claim to only penetrate during sex and never be penetrated, you are not considered gay. So whereas in the US, it would be totally nonsensical for a man to say, I'm not gay, but my boyfriend is. There can actually be parts of the world where that is a sensical statement, and where somebody who says that is not lying about themselves, they're just operating within different rules. And if those are the rules that they've been raised in all their life, and then they move here, of course, the rules here might seem ridiculous to them or may not actually capture their identity. And so, yes, I think it's always very important to resist the tendency to treat these categories as real, even as we take seriously the real effects of these categories. Because even though there's no like objective biological reason to divide people into races or to use the specific racial terms that we use today, there are very real social consequences to those categories, such as violence. Yes, exactly.
Okay, so a couple questions kind of towards the end about process. So I'm wondering, particularly because there's some students in the audience, if you might walk us through, kind of take a step back from passing, but your journey from undergrad to postdoc and how you came to work. You talked a little bit about this in the beginning, kind of on questions that have to do with Jews and race and passing in whatever area of your academic life you'd like to share.
Sure. When I first came to graduate school, I did not think that I was going to be writing about anything Jewish related. As you said, all of us actually. As you mentioned, my PhD actually is in gender studies, and over the course of my PhD program, I noticed more and more how in our conversations about many different types of difference and stigma and identity, somehow Jewishness would always fall out of the conversation, even when people were very proactively including every other type of difference. And the more I experienced that gap, the more I wanted to help provide language, both for scholars and students and a wider public, to better speak about these topics. Because I think for everybody, including many Jewish people, none of us are raised with good vocabulary for this. Like in Hebrew school, we do not get taught like, and here is how to describe conditional whiteness. This is why it says white on your parents' ID, but white supremacists might kill you. We did not get that introduction, although I think that should be taught. It would be good to do like the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, and then also like lesson 2, conditional whiteness. But so that's what drew me to this topic, and that was what led me to write my first book on millennial Jewish stars, because stars like Drake and Zac Efron and Amy Schumer, when people are consuming them on screen, actually so much of the humor and the performance has to do with these subtle assumptions about Jewish bodies and what they're supposed to look like or how they're supposed to move or talk. And so even people who have not consciously articulated to themselves that they have these assumptions about Jewish bodies, these ideas actually are as familiar to many people as our favorite sitcom or star. And that's what led me to write the book. And then in the course of teaching this class on passing, I began to think about the kind of shared threads between many different types of passing. So like in my own family, disability passing, Jewish passing, and queer passing, but also different types of racial passing, class passing. And so that is what has led me to teach and write about passing next.
Yeah. I too came to grad school not intending to work on Jews, or I intended to work on people who are Jewish. The set of figures that I wanted to write about hasn't changed. I just thought that I was going to be able to avoid writing about them as Jews, and realized at some point that that was intellectually untenable. For a lot of reasons, right? So the set of questions that I'm interested in, I've been fascinated since undergrad on the idea of modernity as having undergone a process of what's called secularization. But secularization as a concept depends, and there's incredible work both in religious studies and also among post-colonial scholars on this. Secularization depends on a very Christian model of what religion even is, right? That privileges faith, that privileges, it doesn't fit perfectly with the Jewish experience. I wanted to write about the crisis of modernity, and for a lot of people, the crisis of modernity starts in 1914 when the Great War, the war to end all wars, breaks out. But for a lot of the writers on whom I work, the greatest crisis of all was the Shoah. And so I think what I kept being struck by and what drove me eventually to want to sort of center myself in Jewish studies was the way that even for writers who believed themselves to be fully assimilated, both socially, intellectually, nevertheless, their experiences and therefore their ideas and their writing became, I can't find the English word right now, geprägt, conditioned by, right, changed by their experiences as Jews. And so, you know, I think that's one angle. There's also an angle where, you know, I graduated college in 2016, and a couple months later, Donald Trump was elected. And, you know, a couple, you know, months or a year and change after that, there was a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where, you know, people were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And suddenly, I think, in my own life, the fact of Jewishness became salient in a way that I think mirrored some of what I was thinking about in my work. You know, it became even more important to think about anti-Semitism as a social force, to think about the sort of experience of Jews across time, across space. And so I think both the intellectual, but then the context, I think, has also influenced why I work on what I work on.
Great. And final question, which you may have answered, but feel free to go into a bit more detail. Where, if at all, do you see these questions on passing, on Jews and race, coming up in your future intellectual endeavors?
Yeah. I think more than anything, they're going to continue to come up in my teaching, because I think some of the most important work we can do, especially, you know, in this building, right, is work with students to develop a vocabulary. As you mentioned, nobody teaches you terms like conditional whiteness, right? I think to historicize the concepts that we often are taught to take for granted can then be a tool towards fighting for change. And so thinking about the experience of Jews and the way that their experience challenges common American narratives like the black-white racial divide, challenges American narratives like the idea that we can draw a clean line between race and religion, which I think, especially in a post-9/11 world, like should have been seen to be untenable, but which people are still sort of trying to hang on to. I think that type of work can really equip our students, whatever they're going to do in the world after Stanford or wherever else they study, to fight for change. And so I see it coming up most in my teaching.
I see it continuing both in teaching and writing, and in this new book on passing films, alongside passing films like BlacKkKlansman and Mrs. Doubtfire, I'm also interested in supernatural passing films like werewolf films, alien films, vampire films, and there's quite a lot written in Jewish studies about how particularly werewolves and vampires, like those tales as they evolved in Europe, often had anti-Semitic undertones, particularly the Bram Stoker's Dracula, on which so many vampire tales are based. And so I am interested in thinking about how anti-Semitism interacts with racism and misogyny and queerphobia, not only in a movie like Made in Manhattan, but also in a movie like Werewolves Within. And so that's one of the places I'm heading next.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I'd now like to open it up to the audience to ask what questions you might have for our panelists about any and all things related to the conversation. We'll start in the back.
How do you think debates about conversion within the Jewish community and the experience of converts helps inform this discussion of passing?
I know a few folks who have converted or who are in the process of converting. I think, though, that I've grown up, it's okay. As some of you may know, there are many different branches of Judaism that are different in many different ways, including their view of conversion. And so the varieties of Judaism that I grew up in are pretty at least as far as I can tell, are pretty chill about conversion. And to use a very scientific academic word. And so I did not grow up around like any kind of negative commentary or judgment or sense of inauthenticity around people who had converted. And so I'm not, within the Jewish communities that I know, I've never, for example, seen converts treated as if they were just passing. I do think one thing I could maybe speak more extensively to is sometimes people who were born white and non-Jewish who convert to Judaism may still be seen as whiter to the rest of society than people who were born Jewish. And this is something that the author Marla Brettschneider writes about, that like, so she grew up in an Ashkenazi Jewish family. Her wife, or her partner, who actually I think is a rabbi, but who grew up white and non-Jewish and then converted, when they were living in, I believe, New Hampshire, somewhere in New England, they as a couple often found that her wife was treated as kind of seamlessly whiter than Marla herself was. So that may speak to the dynamics you're addressing.
I also think conversion and discussion of conversion can sort of overlap with discussion of what sometimes gets called Ashkenormativity. And, you know, I had an acquaintance in college who had not herself converted, but her parents had. She was a person of color and was always sort of assumed to have been a convert. And people were sort of always surprised that actually she had grown up in a kosher-keeping home, et cetera, because her race didn't match the expectation of what people assume, you know, someone who grew up Orthodox Jewish would be. And so there is still that kind of presumption. And I don't think it necessarily fits into passing as a category, but it's an example of the way that even communities within themselves can have presuppositions of who they expect their members to be, and the way that those lines are much more fluid than even the communities themselves expect.
I would add also, in terms of conversion, so I work on similar things in the North African context, and not only in the North African context, but when you're talking about Jews who convert to other religions, there's always kind of this question, but like, are they, like, did they really embrace, in the case of the novels I worked on, like, is she really Muslim? Like, did she really do the things? Is she, and this dates back, I'm sure back, certainly to the Inquisition, but this idea that you're like secretly still Jewish, but then passing yourself off, and then kind of like, who decides? And that answer is going to change no matter who you ask and when you ask and who's involved. So yeah, fascinating question. Shayna, I saw your hand.
Okay, so because you're both also scholars of gender studies, I wonder if you can theorize why transgender is a category that is understood in our society now, whether people find it to be abhorrent or embrace it, whereas being transracial, right, the thing that Rachel Dolezal claimed to be, is sort of universally rejected as a possible sort of category that a person can do. So how does gender identity operate differently from ethnic and racial identity?
I think that's a really good question. And actually, there was a day in my gender studies PhD program where we argued about it as like an official seminar topic for 2 hours. And at the end of 2 hours, we had no idea. And I think I'm still there. I think I agree that's a really interesting question. And it highlights, as you said, that our core assumptions about how gender works and our core assumptions about how race works, that these are different. They're not just two different categories. They're categories that are assumed to operate by different mechanics. But I don't have a good answer for that one.
That's helpful.
We also had that debate in one of my classes. Mm-hmm. Not on purpose, it just happened.
Courtney.
Yeah.
I have sometimes quipped that I think that conversion to Judaism is the closest thing our society has to a sort of model of being transracial. If you think about, the book of Ruth, in which the first convert says to Naomi, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. There's this idea of joining a community. A convert is called up to the Torah as, Bar Abraham, Bat Sarah, right? The son of Abraham, the daughter of Sarah. There is this idea of like replacement parentage. And I think there's a mechanism for that. There are, authority figures who can do that, right? There is a rabbi who can say, like, and now you are officially a son of Abraham. And I think the in-between position of Judaism, because it is somewhat, a racial group, somewhat a sort of national political group, and also somewhat a religious group, allows for that sort of in-between where there can be an authority figure who says, like, now you are this. Other races don't really have that, right? I actually saw a scholar of the Black Church once at a conference suggest that the Black Church could adopt something similar, sort of modeled on Jewish conversion, so that someone like a Rachel Dolezal could convert into Blackness. But again, it had to be filtered through that religious community, through that angle. I wonder about naturalizing it as a citizen, right? As a similar process. And again, there's an authority figure who says, like, you are now a citizen of this country. You've passed this test. You've sworn this oath. Because, we don't, and I think for gender, right? That is where the medicalization of gender transition comes in. Like, the doctor says, I'm going to give you this surgery. The doctor says, you have exhibited, these feelings for this long, and there's still like a gatekeeper that you're filtered through. And lots of people in the trans community, especially, like, push back on the medicalization of trans identity. And I'm not staking a claim on whether I think the medicalization of the trans identity is good or bad, just that the figure of the doctor sort of occupies a position that the figure of the rabbi in Jewish conversion can occupy. And when it comes to race, I don't know who would occupy that position.
Can I pick back on that? Though, say that actually, if you want to change it, transgenderism is now accepted, but it's now accepted maybe in modern Western society. But if you go back to Jewish writing, it's been accepted in Judaism. You go back 2,000 years. I mean, Judaism recognized 6 genders way back when. I mean, it's not something modern. So transgenderism has been accepted in many societies as something that has existed for a very long time. So it's not something new. It's something new maybe in 20th century America for a lot of people, but it's been around. And the fact that people are saying that it's new is that's something we need to push back. And I think there's a lot of real reason why the transgender community, a lot of people are pushing back on the medicalization, because it doesn't have to be medicalized, and there doesn't have to be an authority figure saying this person is transgender and this person is not. Because if somebody identifies as transgender, then they're transgender. We're not. Who am I to say they are or not? And then again, if we're going back to saying race is a social construct, and in so many ways it is. Look, I'm not saying. I mean, people can go around identifying as any race they want, but I don't know, how do we draw the lines? And the same, and as Jonathan said before, you can be one race here and then a different race in Brazil, then what does race mean? I mean, none of it makes sense.
I think those are very rich questions, and I also am aware that we have, I think, negative 30 seconds left. What is our timing left?
I mean, yeah, I think we probably have time for one more. Oh, goodness. There's 3. We'll start in the back, I guess.
I think the student should go first.
Oh.
It seems like sometimes people want to be labeled. They want to be seen as a Jewish X or a woman X, scientist, writer, scholar, whatever. And sometimes they don't. And then sometimes when we study people, we apply labels to them. I mean, it sounds like, when we were talking about Max Czalek and people criticizing him, you could make the same critiques of that analysis about people who study Hannah Arendt, right? That, like, why should it matter if she's white or Jewish if you just want to consider her argument? And so I guess my question is, when do you think it's legitimate to apply labels to people, if it is sometimes?
I think I can give a useful example from my book on pop culture. Some of you may know the Jewish rapper Little Dicky, who, as you might guess from his name, is very kind of self-mocking. And he once said in an interview, "I don't walk around feeling very Jewish," but then every single one of his songs is him calling himself a dirty Jew, a Jew business major, a kike, which is a racial slur for Jews. And so if you were just to listen to his interview, I guess it would sound like Jewishness is not very important to his rap, but then there's a lot in his rap that says otherwise. And so I think it's always valid to ask about all the context that has led into a person's work, including their identities, regardless of how they feel about those identities. And I think that all of us do and say and write things with subconscious dynamics going on. And so I think it's always valid to ask the question, as long as we approach it with curiosity instead of approaching it with the assumption that we know what Hannah Arendt's Jewish identity meant to her. So yeah, approaching it with curiosity, I would say, is a key.
Yeah. Arendt is also someone who was called traitor to the Jewish community for certain things she wrote, was called self-loathing for things she wrote. And I totally agree with John that, we have to consider people's context. I also think that it is good for there to be debate within communities. I think someone like Czalek represents a position within German Jewry. His critics might be representing other positions. That's good. Jews are not a monolith, something, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, etc. But, no community is a monolith. And I think when we create space for there to be debate within communities, for every individual within a community to have a different perspective, to have a different, when we take an intersectional analysis and look at things like class differences within communities, when we look at gender differences within communities, I think it can be a really powerful tool for looking at the way that people respond to and engage with and are shaped by their different identity categories, but are also at the end of the day staking out positions that are theirs alone. And, they can be speaking to a community sometimes, maybe they can be speaking for a community, but no one person is ever going to be able to have the final say on any group, and we shouldn't ask them to.
On that note, thank you for the final say. Thank you so much for coming.